welcome to Living by Faith with Trillia Newbell. I'm your host, Trillia Newbell, and I am so thankful to get this short time with you today. You know, I love our theme music. It's hopeful and it's kind of joyful here at Living by Faith. The reality is that we also grapple with the hard, tough things of life. And the holidays, they are here, and I know that many of us are experiencing grief during this time. When I think about my family gatherings and what we are about to look forward to, I also realized that there are many people missing from the seats that they once filled. Grief really, it never leaves us. It just sticks with us. And in many ways, not only do we have to some degree, we do because of just life, we go on. We Go On is the name of a book. It's also the name of a tour by John Onwuchekwa. And he's here today to help us learn to grapple with the grief that we carry and to see hope in the midst of our sorrow. John was born into a home where the gospel was cherished deeply and modeled with excellence. After graduating from college, he studied at Dallas Theological Seminary. He's served at churches in both Texas and Georgia, and in 2015 moved into the historic West End to help plant a church, Cornerstone Church, with his best friends. He and his wife, Chandra, have been married since 2007. They welcomed their daughter, Ava, in 2017. So John and I kind of go way back. I also just learned that he got his PhD from Emory. And so, John, welcome to the show.
Hey, Trillia. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, glad to be here.
It's so good to hear you. And I was telling, he and I were talking before the show started, and I was saying, we just know you as John O. Most of us who know you well just call you John O.
Yep.
So I want you
Since
to
the
tell
third
us.
grade.
Since the third grade. But I said,
Listen,
no. We need to say your last name. And I want to know the
yeah,
origins. What is Onwuchekwa? The origin of it. I'd
yeah.
love to know. Yeah.
Onwuchekwa is Nigerian. So
Nigerian
it,
Onwuchekwa.
yep. Both of my parents immigrated here in the late 70s. And
Okay.
an interesting thing, right, as it relates to the topic is our last name means let death wait, right? So it
Mm.
is this plea for long life. So
Mm.
yeah.
Well, that is actually really appropriate to this conversation we are going to have in just a second. But before we have it, I'd love to hear more about your testimony and hear about your life. I mean, we started out by saying that you grew up in a gospel-centered a home
Yeah.
where it was modeled with excellence. But before we even talk about that, last year, my daughter asked me to make, and I think it's called fufu, and
Oh yeah, yeah,
we had
yeah.
it with Nigerian stew. So I made. She
Oh,
was like,
come
"Mom,
on.
yes." So I was looking everywhere for casa, and I was
Right.
like, I had to make it
Get
from
that.
scratch. And
Right.
I
Look
think I
at
did it well. Yes. So anyways, I just
okay.
wanted, yeah. We in my family love to cook and learn about history and culture and people and so we're constantly doing stuff like that. But but anyways, I wanted to bring that up. That's a Nigerian dish, correct? Oh, I think we lost John. Did we lose John? All right. Well, we will find John in a
Oh,
second, but
all
oh,
right.
are you
I'm
there?
sorry. Yes. I don't know what
Oh,
happened. Sorry.
I don't know either, but
That
I
dial-up internet. That
oh,
dial-up internet. Sorry about that.
well, welcome to 2024. You can
I know.
I'm teasing. Well, I was just saying that it is a Nigerian dish, or at least in that region, correct?
Yeah. Oh man,
Okay.
I grew up on it. So yeah,
Oh, there you go.
I could taste it as you started to talk about it. So yeah,
Well, she being my daughter, she asked me to cook it, and then she asked me, she was like, you cannot, don't spoon it. You're supposed to grab it with your hands and dip it
with
in the
your
stew.
dip it.
So
Yep.
that's what we did. Anyways, it was a lot of fun, and it's just a part of our family. It's a part of our culture
Yeah.
in my house is to enjoy people in different cultures. But tell us about your testimony and and maybe how your home was infused with that hope that your
Yeah.
name says.
Yeah. 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 So I think in the course of these the past 10 years at least, maybe longer, right? We've heard lots of stories of people who have, questioned their faith or departed from their faith largely because of the hypocrisy from people that they once respected and they saw. And my heart just breaks. And as I hear all of that, as I think about my story, I really do feel like it was the grace of God allowing me to grow up in the household that I did, right? I think that there are people that depart from the faith because their faith was, uh, they were introduced to their faith by people who later proved to not have the integrity that our faith claims to build. I think for me, it was the opposite, right?
Mm,
I grew up in a home, and part of the reason why I know this thing is real is because my dad is a preacher, right?
mm.
And I saw both my mom and my dad live behind the scenes better than what they preached. So there's never been necessarily a time where, like, the people that introduced me to the faith, the deepest have been these bastions of faith and an example of faith. And I feel like I would have grabbed a hold of it earlier if it wasn't for my own stubbornness, right? So I grew up
Mm.
in a household where I saw and I knew that it was true. And it took me, right, to not make this whole thing an extended story. It took me after high school, getting robbed at gunpoint on a dirt
Wow.
road in
Wow.
Nigeria with my family to realize, oh, wait a minute. Yeah, I've been kind of playing this church thing, and now I'm getting ready to go out into the world on my own. And I just really felt like, all right, Lord, if you are really real, then please, you have to help me. You have to save us. You have
Wow.
to, yeah, turn my life around. And the Lord did just that through a series of miraculous events. We were saved. Nobody in our family was harmed. We left the country when we should have, despite losing or not, yeah, losing, getting our passports and plane tickets stolen, right? We left a few
Wow.
days later and I came home and yeah, it changed the trajectory of my life, right? All the way from the college that I was getting ready to go to, I decided to kind of change gears, go to Baylor University, and it was there, like on the first day of school, meeting some of my best friends in the world that I have
Mm.
lived next to and done ministry with for the past 22 years
Wow.
of my life. Yeah, so yeah, my story is just one of I had every advantage in the world to embrace God early. I didn't. And yeah, God blessed me with hardship and a near death experience that reminded me of the value of life. And I
Mm.
just constantly saw the Lord pursue me and redirect my path. Um, yeah. And
Wow. His
yeah,
mercy is unending. I mean, it just
yeah,
sounds like he was very merciful for your whole entire family. That is incredible.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And I often say that God never wastes pain. He never wastes
Mm,
suffering. And so
right.
this is just another example of how he was using it um
Yeah.
for your good and
Yeah.
turned you towards him. So you
Abs-
continued on this journey and became a pastor. And
Yes.
yes, and tell us personally how you have gone from pastoring and speaking and how you've dealt with grief.
Yeah. So I started to pastor at 22 years old. So right out
Wow.
of college pastor, helped with a church plant. At 24, in like 11 months, moved to Atlanta with a group of 25 people to be a teaching pastor at a church plant downtown, served there for 6 years. And in 2014, moved to the historic West End, an inner city community here in Atlanta, with a group of folks to help plant this church. And 6 weeks before the church launches, this is April 14th, 2015. Um, Funny enough, I'm at a conference in Orlando, Florida on Heaven. The Gospel Coalition put on a conference
Mm.
on Heaven. I only heard one talk that day from First Thessalonians 4, talking about we don't grieve as the world grieves, we grieve as those with hope.
Yeah.
Mark Dever preached it that morning. We're at dinner at a Longhorn Steakhouse in Orlando, Florida, and I get the phone call um, that leads me to call around and talk to my god brother, and I find out that my 32-year-old brother suddenly
Mm.
passed. Right, he was a pastor in Memphis. No explanation, no cause of death.
Wow.
Premarital counseling appointment that he did with some folks that just started to come to his church. Went into his car, preparing to drive off, and just like that, right, went to sleep and didn't wake back up. And that was when I would say, you know, Francis Weller's going to use this term. I think that's when my apprenticeship with sorrow or apprenticeship with grief began. And um, I was a couple of months away from turning 31 years old, and I felt like the good Christian thing to do was to, try to live with hope, try to change my grief by wearing a smile, and moved forward with planting the church. And grief for us was just unrelenting. 6 weeks later, my
John,
wife's, yes,
I want you to continue this story, and we are about to go on a break, and I do
oh,
not want
absolutely.
to miss any of this.
Let's do it.
Thank you for sharing your heart. And I know so many people relate during this season.
Yeah.
More with John when we return. Living by faith. We are listening to Angels from the Realm of Glory and talking with John Onwuchekwa. He is a pastor and a theologian and a writer, and he leads a tour called We Go On. We Go On. We've been talking about grief. And
Yeah.
John, you were sharing your story about how your brother at the age, is it 32 or 33?
32. Yeah, 32.
32, tragically and instantly um, died in his car, which is heartbreaking. Absolutely
Yeah.
heartbreaking. And so and you were talking about how if your wife then started to experience something, but
Yeah.
what was that?
Yeah. So 6 weeks later, after my brother passed, we plant our church, and it was, right, an incredible day full of joy. And that evening, my wife gets a phone call that her grandmother passed.
Mm.
And um, we had such a young church at that time. It was a bunch of like 20 and 30 somethings, not a lot of gray hair in the room. And for that next year, Trillia, every 3 weeks, somebody from the church got a phone call about a mother, a friend, sibling, a grandparent. And so, yeah, grief was just this
Mm.
companion and it stayed with us. And yeah, I'll never forget October of that year, we baptized my wife's mother and one of her good friends, Elfreda Brown. And in January, we buried Elfreda Brown. And I had done
Wow.
funerals before for people that were not a part of our church. And this was the first one that I'd ever done for somebody that had been a part of the church. And just to
Mm,
see the way that it kind of wrecked us. And um, it wrecked us, but it also strangely like knitted us together as a family. It brought
yeah.
perspective into what, yeah, this life was all about. And uh yeah, for me, a year later, I thought I should be better after my brother passed, and I was not.
Mm-mm.
And not just not being better, I was probably in one of the worst places I'd ever been in my life.
Mm.
And I was just fortunate to have a community of people that could surround me, even as their pastor, and say, "Hey, John, we fear that um, you helping people put their lives together is an anesthesia that has numbed you to the fact that yours is falling apart." And
Mm.
yeah,
Mm.
they granted me a sabbatical at that time. And that was when, maybe for the first time, I really started to process and work through grief and
Yeah.
hope and, yeah, all of the above.
Well, what did that working through look like? Was
Yeah.
it, I'm assuming, did you have other people? Did you go to counseling?
Yes. Yeah. So I was blessed to have a therapist in our church that specialized in grief counseling. And so,
Yeah.
yeah, Asia Duncan saved my life and walked through so much with me. Um, I, you find hope in the strangest places, right? I remember being in my back study where I am right now and reading the book of Ecclesiastes and opening
Mm.
it up and feeling like those first 3 verses were some of the most hopeful that I've ever read, right?
Mm.
Because to hear somebody say meaningless, meaningless, everything is meaningless, it gripped me because
Yeah.
I had felt that way, right? I had felt like I was in this valley because I lost one of the most important relationships of my life. And here I read this book from the perspective of somebody who didn't lose it all. He had it all. And he felt the same way. And that was the first time that it clicked to me, right? If I could be depressed in a valley and he can be depressed on a mountaintop, then maybe depression isn't always circumstantial.
Mm.
And if depression isn't circumstantial, maybe hope isn't either, right? Maybe joy
Ooh.
isn't either.
Yeah.
Maybe nothing about my life has
Huh.
to change right now and everything can change, right? That helped me see, all right, maybe tragedy doesn't ruin anybody. Maybe hopelessness does. And so how do we hold on to hope when tragedy is inevitable and we can't outrun it any more than a dog can outrun its tail? And so I feel like that set me on the trajectory to, yeah, how do you hold on to hope without avoiding tragedy because you can't, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Well, that, um, was more profound than like, there are tears in my I didn't even know I needed that word.
Right. Yeah.
But what an encouragement.
Yeah.
Hope doesn't have to have a circumstance. We
Yeah.
can
Right.
hope, in God. And I imagine right now that people who are listening are grappling and dealing with their own grief, and I'd like to invite you to give us a call.
Yeah.
Give us a call. We would love to encourage you. John can pray for you. Call us at
Yeah.
877-548-3675 or
Yeah.
877 Live 675. Again, it's 877-548-3675 or 877 Live 675. You know, I imagine
Yeah.
that people are listening and I first of all, I'm a little tongue tied because that was such a hopeful statement in the
Yeah.
midst of such hardship. Yes,
Yeah.
and such a
Yeah.
profound look at the book of Ecclesiastes. So
Yeah.
I I got to say that again. Um,
Okay.
but also, I imagine that right now it's Christmas time. What
Yeah.
makes grief harder during this season?
Yeah. So, two things, right? One, a quick word about grief. One of the things that makes it hard is that it's so often not addressed because it's misdiagnosed, right? That
Hmm.
oftentimes when people think of grief, they tend to think of grief primarily as tangible grief. I've got a loved one, their body is dropped into the ground, there's a funeral with a casket. That is grief. And what most people don't understand, first of all, is that um, grief is not necessarily a journey. It doesn't have a start and an end, right? There's no
Right.
expiration date. So the metaphor sometimes of grief as a journey is unhelpful because it keeps people searching for some
For the
light at
yeah,
the end of a closed tunnel, right?
right.
I think if we embrace grief not as a journey, but a language, right, where the goal is not to finish, the goal is to become fluent, the goal is to understand it and to be able to speak to it, then we realize that this language has more than one dialect. Tangible grief, that's the one that we talk through. Most people have never heard of ambiguous loss or grief, but as soon as they hear it, they're like, that's it. That
Mm,
is the problem for which I have not had a diagnosis. Ambiguous grief is a death with no funeral, funeral with no casket, right? It is the
mm.
death of a dream, the death of a marriage, right? The diagnosis of a parent with dementia, where even though they're here, you talk about them in past tense verbs, right? These
Mm.
are all things where um, even though they are ambiguous griefs, your brain and your body does not know the difference.
Yeah.
So, what you find in this time is there's people that are not just grieving the initial loss of a loved one, but they find themselves at this time grieving the loneliness that
Yeah.
comes from that and heaping all types of shame. I should be done with this by now. It's been 9 years. It's been 10 years. And what makes
Mm.
it hard, especially at a time like this, is that everybody wants to be festive and
Yeah.
joyful. And it is so hard to be around people that are sad. And so people find that if they bring their full selves to the table, it can feel isolating or they feel guilty for bringing the mood down. When in reality, um, when we bring our full selves, uh, we give people an invitation to be human. And
Right.
like we'd be surprised at the connection that takes place if we bring our full selves here because yeah, grief feels like humanity's official language, and there's
Mhm.
people that are eager to, yeah, speak it.
Absolutely. We are speaking with John Onwuchekwa. He is the author of We Go On, and he also has a tour called We Go On. And, one of the things about grief that I've also realized, as one who has experienced quite a bit of death and sorrow,
Yeah.
is that when you do bring your whole self, you realize, oh, I'm not alone. And that other
Right.
person needed that. We get to comfort with the comfort we've received from Christ. And so,
Hey,
yeah, I think if there's any encouragement for our listeners today, one, I think that John has encouraged us all that we can be honest and that we can also have hope. And we're going to dig more into hope when we return, but also we can we can bring ourselves and
yeah.
we can ask the Lord for help, but also other people, because it sounds like, John, you had other people helping
Oh,
you. You did not do this alone. And I think
oh,
often when we're in sorrow and pain and suffering, we try to isolate ourselves.
yeah, yeah.
And we have to push against that. And Christmas time is one of those awkward seasons when and when grief and joy, they kind of collide. Everyone's seeing,
Right.
but also I think we maybe don't think of Christmas in the most appropriate ways. Jesus
Yeah.
was a man of sorrows,
Yeah.
acquainted with grief, and so
Fluent in
he
grief, right?
fluent in
Yes.
grief. That's
Yeah.
all about all he experienced in many
Right.
ways, though he endured with for the joy set before him.
Yeah.
It was just sorrow and grief and pain and suffering and isolation and beating and um people denying him. And so maybe that can be some encouragement to our listeners. We have a savior who understands and invites us to come to him. More with Living by Faith when we return. Welcome back to Living by Faith with Trillia Newbell. We have been talking about hope and grief and how we can cling to the Lord. I love that song, Come Thou Long Expected Jesus. And thank you, Lord, that we know you and that you are here with us. And we would love to hear from you. Give us a call at 877-548-3675 or 877-LIVE-675. We would love to encourage your faith during this season or pray for you. Again, it's 877-548-3675 or 877-LIVE-675. You can also always email me at livingbyfaith@moody.edu. Penny, we have you on the line. Oh, I think Penny hung up. But what Penny asked, John, is she
Yeah.
asked, can you comment on the difference in the experiences of losing someone suddenly versus a loss that is anticipated?
Yeah. So this is an interesting one, right? Uh, on Sunday, my wife just lost her maternal grandmother
Mm.
to stage 4 cancer. She's had it for 6 months, and or she got the diagnosis months ago. They told her she had 6 months left. After 4 months, she was gone. And so my wife woke up on Monday morning after she found out. And one of the things that she said to me was she was just like, John, like, I feel like I'm in shock and I don't know why. Like, I prepared for it. Why am I surprised? And, one of the interesting things about grief, anticipatory grief, is we tend to think it's like preheating an oven. Like, all right, if I know it's going to come. Let me just get ready. I can prepare for it. And somehow we can kind of take away the sting. And one of the things that you find is that you you can't, right? There is
Mm.
no way to prepare for what it is that you feel, regardless of how much you tell yourself it's natural, normal, it's going to come. When it does come, there's something deep inside of our souls that testifies to the fact that even though this is expected, it's wrong. Death
Mm.
shouldn't happen, right? Like, my love for, like, I shouldn't have to enter a relationship with somebody and then say goodbye, right? Our souls testify to the fact that it's
Yeah.
wrong. And I think when somebody dies suddenly, there's a whole host of things that we feel. We feel a sense of regret. I wish that I could have said this. I never told my brother one last time that I loved him. We got into a fight, and or like there's all these things that go in our mind. From an anticipatory standpoint, I don't think we live as much with regret if we've used that time the best that we can. But I do think that the danger is to live with a sense of shame or telling ourselves that we shouldn't feel the way that we felt because we knew that it was coming. And I feel like, yeah, with both types of grief, we just need to sit with it and feel what we feel and not tell ourselves what it is that we should feel.
Absolutely. It's hard to sit with grief as
Oh,
it's hard. You
yeah.
or for certain personalities, it can be hard. You because
Yeah.
you want to just be better.
Yeah.
You just you want to be better. So or like feel better. How
Yeah.
can you encourage the person who hasn't really learned what it means to lament and to
Yeah.
mourn and to weep? How can you encourage the person? How can you learn to do those things?
Yeah. This is and it's gonna sound like I'm just like saying the same things, and part of it it's because I am.
Right.
Grief makes us feel like it's some journey that we have to take by ourselves or we have to learn. When it's like, no, like if we embrace grief as a language, then we realize, oh, the way that anybody learns how to speak is not in isolation. Nobody learns sitting with books and dictionaries. You have to immerse yourself and put yourself around people that are fluent, right? So there's this story, and I think I've learned so much from two of my dearest friends in the world, Jordan and Jessica Rice, right? They pastor a church, yeah, in Harlem, New York. Jordan and Jessica are 43 and 42 respectively. They've been married for the better part of the last 10 years, and it is both of their second marriages because in their late 20s, both of them were tragically widowed. Jessica lost her
Mm.
spouse 2.5 months into a motorcycle accident. Jordan lost his wife. She was diagnosed with a rare form of brain cancer 10 months in. And one of the interesting thing was they dated other people before they met each other. And as soon as it got to the story of their loss, the other people that they dated would say what we all learned to say, sorry for your loss. But then the more that they wanted to talk about their spouse, the person that they dated, they got jealous and they felt like, oh, is there enough room for me? Can we move on? Can we talk about joy? So all the relationships would go so far and then they would stop.
Yeah.
Well, then Jordan and Jessica met each other. And for the first time, they found somebody else that was fluent in what it meant to be a widow. And they
Mm.
realized, oh no, the only way that you're going to get to know me is to know Jaron and Danielle. And the conversation didn't stop at sorry for your loss. Both of them said, no, 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 no. I welcome you telling me stories about your love. And an interesting thing took place. The more that they talked about their grief, the more they realized there was this greater capacity for love. And what their story shows us is this, right? It is impossible for them to share their grief story without sharing their love story. And it's impossible for them to share their love story without sharing their grief story. And so we don't see grief and joy, sorrow and hope as these parallel streets, right? They are these winding roads that intersect at so many points. And when you
Yeah.
stand at the center of an intersection, you're reminded um, sharing a story about grief doesn't mean that you're perpetually sad, right? There
Right.
are these times where, yeah, like, yeah, coffee, right? Like, if you lean into the bitterness of a good cup of coffee, you'll realize that, oh, coffee is actually a fruit. And there are sweetnesses on the back end that are reserved for people that'll lean in. And there are
Mm.
times where if we lean into the bitterness of that grief, we see these pieces of truth on the back end, right? My brother died April 14th, 2015. And for the better part of 2 years, I was angry and frustrated and mad at God because I felt like he made a mistake in the story that he was writing. And 2 years to the date, April 14th, 2017, on Good Friday, my premature daughter, who had not breathed on her own, takes her first unassisted breath on the day that
Mm,
my brother took his last, on the day that
mm,
our Savior took his last earthly breath. And you are reminded, yeah, that no, grief and hope can coexist on the same day. And so, what I would
mm.
encourage folks to do is lean in. More than sorry for your loss. Once we start to tell stories about our loves that we lost, then I think we open ourselves up to see the story that God is continuing to write.
Mm. Well, God is continuing to write. You have over and over again caused me to be completely breathless. Like the Lord has been so faithful in your life. And as I listen, all I can think about is the faithfulness of God in my life. And as all of our listeners listen, I pray that you are experiencing the same. More when we return. Welcome back to Living by Faith with Trillia Newbell. Who does not love that song? Oh, come, all ye faithful. I'm actually going to read a part of the lyric because I think that it connects well with what we are talking about, this intersection of grief and joy. And how does it work? How does it work? Oh, come, all ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. Oh, come to Bethlehem. Come and behold him, born the King of angels. Oh, come, let us adore him.
Mm.
And how do we do that? Come, ye faithful, joyful and triumphant. And that is a question that I'd like for us to explore on this last segment with you, John. We have been talking a lot about grief and joy intermingling and how our grief doesn't go away and it never will. And I failed to share my own story, and I'm not going
Yeah.
to dive too far deep into it. I will just say that I have had four miscarriages. I lost my
Mm.
sister also
Mm.
at a tender age and young and
Mm.
in her 40s. And then I lost my father at the age of 19, and he was my best friend. And so
Mm.
and my husband has experienced, therefore I have experienced the suicide of his brothers. We
Oh
have
my goodness.
experienced a lot of grief and sorrow and pain and suffering. And I can attest to absolutely everything that you have said, which is
Right.
partly probably why my heart is both every time you speak, I'm crying. I'm over here like,
Yeah.
oh Lord, this is so true. May you comfort so many people because I am experiencing it as we talk.
Right.
And also I am joyful. And people
Right.
may not, unless we talk and you hear my testimony, know of all the sorrows I've experienced.
Yeah.
But in many ways, I relate to what I believe Paul said in the scriptures that he is sorrowful yet always rejoicing.
Yeah.
So how can
Amen.
we have joy?
Yeah.
And what is the real biblical definition of joy? Because I think we get that wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. You know, you said so much there, and
No, sorry.
no. It's all good, right? I think one of the most salient right points that you made is just something that I come back to a lot, right? That you know, if your life were a restaurant, um, grief would come in and it would convince you in times of sorrow that it has a standing reservation at every table.
Mm,
And it doesn't. It doesn't. And we see it by the sheer fact that like joy does break in, and the thing that threatens our joy and our hope in those times is it feeling as if we shouldn't feel it. So we stuff it down and we try our best to mute it. And I think that one of the ways that we can prime our pump to experience joy is just to realize that our lives are very unpredictable, right?
Yes.
Our like seasons in life, they are not permanent, right? There are good times and there are bad times. When the good times come, we remind ourselves that they won't last forever. When the bad times come, I think we have to remind ourselves of the same thing. Um, but seasons of life, although they're not permanent, they're not predictable either. Life constantly changes lanes without putting on its turn signal. And I think we just have to be prepared for that. And one of the best ways that we get prepared for that is listening to the stories, the complex stories of people that have just been surprised by joy. And that's one of the best parts about the scriptures and the Bible, the fact that so much of it is narrative, is we read and we see all these plot twists and turns, and we see the way that God just breaks through and can elevate somebody from the bottom
Mm,
of a prison cell to the palace
right.
in an instant without their intervention. And yeah, we just have to remind ourselves that yeah, if God has done that for one of his children, God may not do the same thing, but he'll do something similar for all of his children, because God doesn't have any favorite children. And so
Mm,
it is this concept of we have to remind ourselves that yeah, grief and hope coexist. The
yes.
storyline has been repeated time and time again. Yeah, and the God that has done it before will not neglect to do it
Mm,
for us, right? Patience is the ingredient. It is the key. We have to remind ourselves that our story, however bad, is being written by somebody very good. And at the
yeah.
present time, our story is yet an incomplete one.
Yes, and it reminds me of Romans 8. I just turn to Romans 8 all the time, and
Yeah.
just that our suffering is momentary.
Yeah.
Thankfully, there is an expiration date on it,
Right. Yes.
insofar as one day he's
Right.
making all things new, and there will be no more tears, no more sorrows, and that he
Yeah.
will never leave nor forsake us. And
Yeah.
so we can cling to those promises. I have a quick question
Yes.
about we this is I'll just say this is time together is too short.
Okay.
We have so
Yeah.
I have so many other things that we could be talking about. Oh, you're this has been such a special time.
Yeah.
But how can we encourage the person who's adjacent to the sufferer? In other words, maybe you're a parent, maybe you're a spouse, and maybe you're a child and you have a suffering parent. But
Yeah.
you want to care for that person who is mourning and grieving. How can we
Yeah.
encourage that person?
Yeah. Sit. Just
Mm,
just sit. Patience is your friend. The grief will not be over anytime soon. And
mm.
so you just need to sit. A quick story, my daughter in the pandemic wanted to learn how to cook. She was, 4 years old, buttered toast. She loves it. I get up one morning and I see her with bread, a butter knife, and a cold piece of butter, and the bread is just mangled. And she looks at me and she says, "Dad, I have all the ingredients, but it doesn't work. What am I
Mm,
missing?" And I said, "Sweetheart, you're missing one thing." And she said, "What?" And I said, "Patience. If you're working that hard, you're doing something wrong. The butter is cold. You need to do nothing except for just wait for the butter to warm up. And once it does, you'll be surprised at how effortlessly you can spread it across that bread." I think when it comes to comforting those that are grieving, the missing ingredients is patience, right? We've been
mm.
wrongly informed. We hear about the 5 stages of grief, and nobody scrutinizes it and realizes the sample group that was used to create the 5 stages of grief were people that were on their way to death with a terminal disease, not the people that they left behind, right?
Mm,
So the 5 stages of grief was created not even studying the people that were actually grieving. And people feel frustrated because people don't fit a custom suit that was not made for them. It's going to be here a
mm,
long time. Get comfortable, be patient, and sit and wait. And I
yeah.
promise you, the coldness of that grief is going to warm up. And when it does, the most important thing is that you're in arm's length or shoulder's length of the
Mm,
griever that is ready
mm.
to talk, ready to speak.
Amen. That is so
Yeah.
good and such important. That is important for us to learn to sit and wait and be patient because
Right.
we don't know how long, and it's likely lifelong for many of us who
Absolutely.
we are grieving. Okay, real quick, how can people learn more about your tour and find
Oh,
you?
yeah. You can go to wegoontour.com. So we've done 4 cities this year. We'll do 25 next year. So it'll be at a place near you. And we just tried to create an evening that was designed to help people to hold on to hope by creating an artistic expression of how grief and hope coexist. So from film, storytelling, music, connection, laughter, conversation, we just wanted to create a place where grievers and would be comforters alike can come in. So we go on tour. You can find everything that you need there.
And you can also find more about the tour and John on our website, livingbyfaithradio.org. I'd like to thank my guest, John Onwuchekwa. What a good time it was for joining me today. Also, thanks to the behind-the-scenes team at Moody Radio, my producer, Karen Hendren, my engineer, Merle St. James, and Tierra on the phone lines. To grow daily in your faith, you can tune into my 52 Weeks in the Word podcast. You can find it at moodyradio.org. To hear today's program again, you'll find it at livingbyfaithradio.org or on the Moody Radio app. You can also connect with us through Facebook and Instagram at Living by Faith. Living by Faith is a production of Moody Radio, a ministry of Moody Bible Institute.